lively and a continuation of our last discussion. We have clearly the issue of the globalization, the impact of globalization, whether it was oversold, whether the promises are unfulfilled, and what are the fundamental challenges of the liberal economic order. For this and the panel, at the end of the day, I take off my think tank hat and put on my Professor of International Studies hat, but I will keep my views to myself. But it is very clear, and was very much present in the last discussion, that the liberal economic order, which does not only focus on economics, but on security and in terms of diplomacy and politics, is being challenged not only from the traditional institutions and countries that felt that they were outside of that order or were not benefiting from it, but now there is a dual challenge of those who are members challenging the efficacy of the order and, more importantly, the institutions that have guided it. I think for our colleague from China and others, the question, I think, clear and the most problematic thing that we face in a multipolar world, and I will suggest that in a multipolar world, all poles are not equal, and power remains an important determinant, whether we like it or not. And the question is, within that context, and if we are to replace the liberal economic order, what is the order that we will embrace and will guide our institutions and countries going forward? We know what the shortcomings and the successes that the liberal economic order has provided. It is uncertain to me what the new order in terms of economics and otherwise will be. And it is always difficult to bring a new order into place, and the most difficult period in world history and politics, and IR documents this, is a multipolar world. And so the call for rules in a multipolar world, in a polycentric Asia, are essential, especially given the imbalance in terms of relations. But the question is, what are those rules? And how do we bring in a new order of things? And since our colleague from China has returned, I would say, in terms of think tanks, Xi Jinping has said repeatedly that he wants to have think tanks in China rival the other think tanks in the world, but they must be with Chinese characteristics. And so in the context of this discussion, and based on the role that China will inevitably play, what is a world, what are institutions in terms of an economic order with Chinese characteristics? Or is it polycentric, and how do we achieve that in terms of it? So more fundamentally, and separate from the previous discussion and the discussion this afternoon that will deal with how do you achieve sustainable development and save our planet at the same time, we are parking the planet part of the discussion and really focusing on the economic order and the role that whatever that order is and whatever the new order is, how that will continue to shape the world and hopefully lift more and more people out of poverty. We have a distinguished panel to discuss this, and I will turn without further ado. All of the bios are provided, and so I will dispense with formal introductions and go directly in the order of as they appear on the program to Rajesh.
Thank you. I think I'll stand, and I have a presentation.
Okay.
Very good morning, and thanks, Jim, and thanks.
Let's make sure we have the presentation up.
Yes.
Okay, good, okay.
I did check. That
Okay, good, good. I can't see it, so I don't know. I'm taking this on faith.
Right. Okay. I think there will be some trouble in others seeing here because there is no second screen, but once again, a very good morning. And I am taking the discussion that has already been held a little forward with some specific focus to India, South Asia, and RCEP. So three taken together because that is what the scenario that I thought I'll be discussing is. So this is about trade, investment, and models of growth. What we already have seen is that this century, that's what was said in the first session, belongs to Asia in a way. And the 19th century was Europe, the 20th century United States, 21st century Asia. However, I think I heard a very interesting presentation recently on World Development Report, where there has been a discussion on global value chains, which I moderated at a presentation by Aditya Mattu at Brookings, India. The only thing additional I want to bring to the table is that there is a Japanese economist who generally is not mentioned, Akamatsu, who wrote in 1930s about the flying geese phenomena. Many of us, when we discuss about the absolute advantage, Adam Smith, and comparative advantage, Ricardo, the third economist that I always give a lot of credit for what the global value chains today are is Kaname Akamatsu, Japan, who wrote about that when a sector becomes sunset in one country, it becomes sunrise in another country, and the production platforms shift. It's such a powerful theory behind the behind the global value chains that I cannot resist just mentioning it. But then, I will not restrict myself to global value chains, but since this is the growth model that I need to discuss, the second thing, the issue, again, multilateralism versus regionalism, it's complete chaos. If you see the slide, I don't want to, but for the benefit of some of those who cannot, there has been a debate between multilateralists and regionalists that multilateralism is the best, hence WTO. Regionalism is good, hence go to the bilaterals, trilaterals, or FTAA, Free Trade Area of Americas, and large EU, etc. The views are that they are mutually conflicting or reinforcing. For me, as a researcher, I have done computable general equilibrium models on trade for 25 years now. For me, I cannot understand, interpret, and the end result seems to be chaos and confusion. Now, there is yet another statement that Pascal Lamy had given in 2008 in July in Geneva, that why do you worry if Doha development round has run into 7 years? The average age is 7 years for rounds. And when I compute the average age of the rounds before Doha round, it turns out to be only 2.6 years. The fallacy that probably Lamy had in mind was he was taking the total period of 1948 to 2008 and dividing that by 7, which was patently wrong. And hence, this is my computation of each round. And then I saw that these were going in arithmetic progression, but Doha round has passed its teens, close to 20 now, and arithmetic progression, which I saw since 1960 also now fails. Therefore, the issue on the ground is that no one is sure, is it multilateralism, or is it regionalism, or is it plurilateralism, which one is going. So I have some numbers, and therefore I needed a PowerPoint presentation. So my questions, basic questions in the discussions that we can have, that what was the problem with the multilateralism? When I read the literature up to late 1980s, things were going multilateral, but with CUFTA and NAFTA in 1989, Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and North America Free Trade, and NAFTA 1993, I think the copycatting started elsewhere, and we had multiple bilaterals. And then big blocks like We dreamt of FTAP, TPP, TTIP, RCEP, 2012. Now, again, here is a confusion. WTO, RCEP, chaos. India must participate proactively. So my only answer to this is that in the global debate, there is no way that India cannot or can sit passive. India must, and I think Ambassador Mohan, you said also that India has to participate. We cannot be sitting on the fence and watching. Look, I have some experiments to show, but I would spend just a couple of minutes on India's growth. See, what has happened in India, the growth slowdown that we are seeing currently from about 8% growth, 9% growth in early this decade to 5% today is quite disappointing, number one. Number two, the trade integration that India has gone into down, the share of exports to GDP was close to 25%, and share of imports to GDP was close to 31% in 2011-12 or 12-13. We surprisingly are down to 20% as share of exports, and we are down to about 23% as the share of imports. Therefore, the global integration and what we see, India is going down. But what I did, now see, in this, I did some computable general equilibrium experiments where I thought that talking about RCEP is good, but talking about South Asia is also important. So if you see some simulations, this is a complicated general equilibrium model where in the first experiment, I say, let the four South Asian countries unite and create an FTA. Next, I bring China in, it becomes 5 countries FTA. Then I bring ASEAN in, NI is in, Japan and Australia, New Zealand in. Now, it mimics something like an RCEP, but an RCEP with a difference where South Asia is also included, because otherwise South Asia is not included in the RCEP. I get some very interesting results. That was the purpose of showing the numbers. You see, when there is a South Asia block, simulation 1 shows that India gains. But if you see India's gains, they continuously increase when the block becomes bigger. In the second simulation, you see, I bring China in, then I bring ASEAN in, NI is in, Japan in, and when the block becomes bigger and bigger, the gains to India increase. And those member countries who are joining, if you can see the red diagonal, they also start gaining. This is just to say that if an RCEP-like arrangement is signed, there is, and there are limitations to this, so I'm not going into that. But one of the important things that I found through my simulations, computable general equilibrium simulations, is that if RCEP is constituted the way I am doing it and opens up the trade to the rest of the world, the gains become even higher. So it's no philanthropy, but it is gains, win-win situation for everybody. My last few minutes, because we are running late, there is a report released by IIFT, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, WTO Center, which is the high-level advisory group. Please note that India has, in recent years, declared 3 things which are worth being discussed and whether we can achieve that or not. One is the doubling farmers' income. Second is doubling India's exports. That is what this high-level advisory group is saying. And taking India to a 5 trillion economy, all in 6 to 7 years. So very ambitious targets, but then what we see and what this report says, and this report was probably publicly released 3 or 4 days before the RCEP meeting in Bangkok was to be held. It clearly says that if US and China are at trade war, India might gain due to trade diversion, but I am not going into that. The most important thing, two messages that I would like to convey is that a hypothetical RCEP-like free trade area, when US and China are not fighting a bilateral trade war, would benefit us all. However, China's benefit would be less if it's a trade war between China and US and RCEP is constituted. Finally, issues of deliberations. I can come to this with, when we end. So what is important? For India, I think it is very important that apart from what we are talking externally, there have to be, if the growth model has to sustain domestic reform and domestic steps to be taken. The first is a fallacy or a misnomer that I often hear, that India is a big economy. There is huge domestic market, so why export? Depend on the domestic market. Now, that is one of the, any free trade or thinking trade economists would understand that this is not done. Because if you are competitive, if your efficient resource allocation has been assured, exports would happen. So big domestic market pride is a misnomer, and hence why export. Secondly, international cooperation would help boost domestic reforms. This is two-way. When you sign international agreements, you are bound to have domestic reforms automatically, and this has been written, so I'm not going into details. Pending factor market reforms, much more needs to be done on land, labor, and capital, logistics and infrastructure. And one of the things that I always think seriously is about the real time. It's time to boost the R&D, have patents, designs, etc., rather than just export what you are manufacturing. One of the most recent reports is on Skilling India, where we have a huge slack. Skilling India, no time to lose. Acquiring, matching, anticipating. It's a wonderful report that is uploaded on NCAER website, which talks about that what is the deficit in skilling, because of which we have number of trained engineers, but they are not employable. Finally, the issue of social benefits or social welfare to be done in a better way, that is direct benefit transfers. The schemes are working on this. And last but not the least is why India has not been able to be a big part of the global value chains is the most recent topic that we have been discussing, the global value chains. Whereas I have slight differences here because these are not global value chains. Many of these are regional value chains where there is a factory Europe, factory US, factory Japan. But yes, there have to be conditions made favorable for India to be participating in global value chains in a big way. And that would be a win-win situation for growth as well as for the trade that India is having deficit on. Thank you very much.
Just thank you very much for providing a series of concrete proposals for going forward in terms of rethinking models of economic growth and development for the region. I want to remind everyone that we're on a tight time schedule, and we have the minister coming at 1, so we're going to make sure that we complete this session with questions before 11 or by 11:30. Manoj, if you...
Yeah, thank you, James. I would like to go back a little bit to the history that before industrialization, process took place about 250, 300 years ago. Bulk of the world, about 95% of the world's population, they lived only at subsistence level. It is only a few aristocrats who had a better level of living. Otherwise, people they were trying to meet both ends meet. That is the story for almost everybody. given that what the Industrial Revolution changed is the introduction of technology. What it meant is output per worker will be rising, and so also the income. And that led to the growth process, first in Europe, America, and later on, as you know, in the Asian story is only about last 5 decades or so. After the most of the countries, they got liberated from the colonial era. Now, in this process, obviously Asia is a late entrant. It started with Japan and then other Asian countries, and later on China and India, possibly one of the last. Now, what has happened because of the global growth in trade and investment, the countries benefited. So most of the Asian countries, they benefited largely due to taking advantage of the growth in international trade. For India also that happened during 2003 to 2011 or so. Then suddenly things started changing. We started thinking about or rethinking about the new growth process, whether we can sustain it. Several people in the about 15 years ago, when they were visiting India, even from USA and other places, the think tanks, they used to see the children going to the schools, and they used to see that what kind of bright future will be there for them. Precisely because of the 8 to 9% growth that was happening. In my own assessment, this is an adjustment period. Growth is never linear. It goes in, it jumps from one level to the other, comes down and again jumps. And the history that I was telling about the Europe or America, their growth rates were only around, on an average, about 3% or so on a per capita basis. But it continued for several decades, not only just decades, possibly a few centuries. And that is what helped them to grow to a different level. So it is not what kind of growth that we are having at a particular time, but whether we can sustain it. We can sustain it at a fairly decent level so that overall level of living increases. In India, as you know, for example, when the liberalization was advocated, it was advocated on 2 grounds, that it will lead to higher growth and it will also help in reduction of poverty. And the history of various countries, if we try to see, no country has been able to abolish mass poverty without growth. That's a stylized fact. But at the same time, growth by itself may not ensure welfare for the masses. And it is here that the new rethinking is coming up. People are questioning, is growth helping everybody? Some of the regions, of course, were discussed in the earlier session, that if inequality in income and wealth rises so much, the benefit from 1% growth to the society, that will be falling. And if it is on a declining trend, that creates kind of uneasiness, and the aspirations of the youth, that also gets hurt. There is they have to change, and the aspirations have been raised quite a bit, partly because of the success in growth itself. So it is in this context that what are the kind of new policy issues that needs to be addressed. You know, one thing is certain, almost everybody agrees, that government will play its role in infrastructure development, whether it is physical infrastructure or social infrastructure like education and health. In fact, a large part of the growth theory, particularly in the East Asian countries context, that also traces to the main role played by the education and health sector in the growth process, in increasing the productivity. So that part is not, question now is whether the government can continue to play that role. The fiscal space of the government is shrinking. It is shrinking not only because of several factors, but among them also the kind of issues that you see now, that if we don't give competitive tax advantage to the multinational agencies, possibly they will not invest in India. Now, given that, the trade-off then comes to what extent government can play a role and what are the other supplementary institutions that needs to be developed. There was a time when we used to say that 35–40% tax rate is a fairly reasonable one. Now possibly people are asking for 20–25%. If that is so, how much space is there for government to play the major role? And if indeed inequality is rising, wealth is getting concentrated in certain hands, we have to rethink about how to use that wealth for the benefit of the society. It cannot be used only for the benefit of a few. And it is here that the philanthropic organizations can play a major role. And so also, other social organizations. It is not just a question of money, but several other factors. And we need to concentrate on that for the welfare of the people so that they take advantage of the growth process. Otherwise, question of jobs will be debated. I'll only make one more point, that since we're talking about, and Rajesh also was telling about, the international growth process and domestic demand. In my own analysis, possibly I'll say that if we don't stress so much on exports and trade, our growth rate will be down at least by 1 to 2%. 5 to 6% we might be able to sustain, but otherwise in a closed economy, it is not possible to have higher growth. We have to reconcile with all the benefits and costs of getting integrated with the world. If you want the benefit of coupling, there will be some cost of coupling also. I think it is in these lines that we need to think over, and there will be losers and gainers in the process, but the policy making challenge will be how to compensate the losers so that they also cooperate. Thank you.
So without further ado, Rurani? And as a segue to our next panel, and I would point out that we made a great effort that every panel, that there were women on each and every panel in the session, and you provide a segue to our next session.
Thank you for inviting me. For the note of this session on commenting on the what kind of integration or trade integration would be beneficial for global growth or regional growth, I would like to say a few things about what are the actually major economic challenges faced by the developed as well as developing economies from a growth theorist point of view. So if you see the world order, both the developed and developing countries are now having lower growth, high employment rate, and that's the problem. Like in the developing economies, like the big giants like China, India are now having lower growth, and rising unemployment. But if you think deeply about the characteristics of the problem, so the long-term challenges that the developed countries face is different from the long-term challenges that the developing countries face. The developed countries are, if you think in sort of a development frontier, they are already there. So for them to increase, for having higher growth, higher employment, higher everything, what they need is a new frontier. And if you look at the world history of growth since the Industrial Revolution, before which the economies used to be agrarian, all the time world in growth experienced a structural break only when there has been new invention came up, like during the Industrial Revolution, during the mass production technique introduced in the US, and then service-led growth that happened in India and China. So those are the kind of, every time there has been innovation which led to a new frontier. So for the developed world, they need a kind of, to my view, is a sort of a integration more into the, not trade in goods, as you said, but maybe in trade in research and development, to have more of a learning society, as Joseph Stiglitz says, that a learning society is only that can be an engine for, higher growth process. And but for the developing countries, there are still policy spaces because they are within the frontier, and their challenges is to how fast they can move towards the frontier. So since their pace of moving towards the frontier has declined, so now they have still have some policy spaces in the individual government level, where and as the new growth theory or the endogenous growth theory says, that infrastructure is can play a phenomenal role in increasing the long run growth rate in the countries. So it could be that integration among the developing countries on infrastructure policies, like each other helping each other in infrastructure building, might be beneficial for long run growth rate for this set of economies. So with that, I would like to just conclude my.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will now open for discussion. We have basically 20 minutes, and I would start with posing a question that was posed to the panel. Can the fundamentals of liberalism and democracy survive the Asian century, or is there an alternative version of liberalism and democracy brewing in Asia? And if so, what is it, and how is it connected to creating the rules of... Oops. This was the first one. Sorry. I still want to pose that question in terms of what is emerging. Do we have a clear sense of what the alternative to the liberal economic order is, and how that affects growth and development, or future growth and development? We've heard a range of perspectives, but the question is, what is your sense of whether sustaining economic growth and development is possible, and what is what are the rules of the road or the structure that may or should guide that process? And there are competing views, although the alternatives are not clearly articulated. Yes, of course.
So thank you very much. I thought that was an interesting and important panel, and in several respects, even though I participated in the first panel, and therefore I think the first panel is important, but I think this is a much more substantive panel, because really the bottom line is, in my view, if you have to sustain a liberal, and your question was that, a liberal international order, you need trade to back you up on that. Otherwise, it really becomes blah, blah at the end of the day, you know. So my worry is, I'm sure my German friend may not, sorry, my friend may not agree with it, but I think there is a fragmentation of the multilateral trading system, a very serious fragmentation of the multilateral trading system, in my view anyway. And if you take India's case, it's interesting. We have $100 billion trade with the following trading partners. All of them are important because it's $100 billion. And for India, we are not like China, so $100 billion is a substantial amount. We have US, we have EU, we have China, we have GCC, and we have ASEAN. With all of them, we have a $100 billion trade each. The only FTA we have is with ASEAN. So we are these lone rangers struggling with MFN and the multilateral trading system when the entire world has moved away, including Japan, which used to be, along with India, the friends of MFN. And Japan has swung so much to the other extreme that it is now signing FTAs right, left, and center. Vietnam has signed with EU. EU is our biggest trading partner. And for the sake of a few Bordeaux bottles and a few BMWs, we screwed it up. So we should have really signed an FTA with Europe, but we haven't been able to do that. So my question really is for India, it comes at a bad time. The economy is not doing so well. The international economic environment, notwithstanding other voices, is, I think, difficult. And for India, to be able to trade on MFN basis indefinitely is not possible. So for India, it really is a problem. But to answer your specific question, if you want the liberal international order to be sustained, one of the basic underpinnings of that was the WTO. And that was the main underpinning for a liberal international order. Now, I really feel pained saying this because I spent long hours at the WTO in Geneva. I could have played golf and used my time better if I had known this is what was going to happen to the WTO, but that's a joke. But that's a joke. But really, the WTO is moving away from multilateralism, whether we like it or not. And I do feel a little bit of responsibility. I don't think India is responsible for the state of affairs, but we can't duck it either. We went on saying no to many of the propositions for multilateral negotiation. So what do you expect the countries to do? If you continue to say no, 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 they will walk out and do something else. So to some extent, we have to feel responsibility. But regardless of that, if you have a WTO without an appellate body and which has a plurilateral agreement not based on MFN, and you have a free-for-all that Mr. Donald Trump has initiated, and everybody else is following, by the way, including India. Because we are all, I mean, the original sin was committed by him, but nobody else is lagging behind. EU is imposing punitive tariffs, and even India is imposing punitive tariffs, even though we are an economic pygmy. But we are, because, we can't stay quiet. So I feel in this background, I would say that unless something happens very rapidly, your liberal international order based on a multilateral trading system is finished. That, I think, is completely over. You have to be an incurable optimist to believe now that WTO can be revived. It's just too late. We went on saying the US is just bluffing, and at the last minute, the US will ask for some concessions. But they were not bluffing. Robert Lighthizer has kept his word. He said, I want to go back to the GATT system because I can pick and choose. I will have a panel report which is in favor of US, I will accept. If it is not in favor of US, I will reject it. He's got exactly what he wanted. And we didn't see the writing on the wall. So I worry about that aspect, but thank you, Jim.
Okay. So I like, there any other
yes.
comments? I understand that are there others? I just want to make sure that I recognize them. 3, so 1, 2, 3. And the interventions 4. So we have a quick intervention so that the panelists can have the opportunity to respond.
Yes, I support Mohan Kumar's argument, and I like to ask that the global growth is declining, no doubt, and India is not exception to that. And my question is that whether the US and China tariff conflict has impacted on the India's growth structure. I like to ask Dr. Manoj Panda.
No, actually, there's a question here. Yeah. And then here, and then...
just to keep it short, I think we may need to be careful in overestimating the level of liberalism that existed in what we call the liberal trade, liberal order or trade. I just mentioned a couple of examples. I think WTO has been full of holes from the very beginning. And effectively what we've had is an order that was trying to be rule-based, but based on the fact that the rules served those who made the rules. And when they didn't, they were interfered, undermined, and we are seeing the natural progression of that. Because I have to be short, the big issue we haven't discussed is that, you know, can you give me any economist, I'm an economist so I can say it confidently, that can apply the theory on free trade and argue that the movement of people isn't as equally important in terms of increasing economic gain or benefit as the movement of goods. And yet, we'll debate Samuelson's theory later, and yet there is absolutely, we have seen reversals of that, where capital can move freely and people can't. The negotiating power is always in favor of capital and against labor. And so I think in Asia we need to have that conversation. Why, even though the liberalization of services has always been on the agenda, we've never got to it. And equally, we need to talk about agriculture for African farmers. So these are the big issues that can change growth and prospects for the poor. The ability to move and the freedom and the ability for agriculture of the poor not to be disadvantaged. And I think we should keep those on the table.
Okay. So panelists, prepare yourselves. We will have a lightning round at the end where you will have a minute and a half to respond. So pick what of the observations you're going to respond to. Back there again.
Hello, I'm Melissa Conley-Tyler. I'm at AsiaLink at the University of Melbourne, and it's great to see so many colleagues I knew from think tank summits all the times I was at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I wanted to really come back to Dr. Chadha on RCEP. So you showed very clearly through your modelling the gains that are potentially there for India, but India has, at this point, decided not to join. I'm very conscious that it's still open. So the Australian government position, for example, is that we would really love to have India in RCEP and that the door is still very much open. What do you see as the prospects? And I suppose I'm responding a bit to Dr. Kumar's comments around, you know, so often India has been a spoiler on international trade, and now you are seeing some of the results in the breakdown. Do you think there's any realistic way to try to get RCEP as over the line as a commitment to that international trading order?
Yes. Actually, it's here, and then to you.
Hi, my name is Sabina Dewan. I'm executive director of a think tank called Just Jobs Network. And prior to this, I was at the Center for American Progress handling, I was director of international economic policy handling their trade portfolio. The reason I mention this is because I am a free trader, but I think it's important in this discussion to acknowledge that both the populist uprising and the swing towards protectionism that we are currently witnessing is a result of a failure for macroeconomic policies to deliver on the well-being of communities and actual people, particularly my area of work, which is jobs and wages. So in this discussion, once again, I think we are talking about the multilateral trading system or regionalism. We're talking about economic growth when the reality is, as I think one of the speakers just mentioned, when the reality is that really I think we need to think about how some of these macroeconomic policies, how trade, how global value chains are actually affecting communities and people in these communities, so not taking so much of a macro approach, but more of a micro approach, and rectifying some of the asymmetries of power that exist in order to address the real concerns of real people. And I think that what we're witnessing in terms of the failure of the WTO and the multilateral system is a failure of the system to work for communities.
Okay.
Very quickly. Perhaps I'm an uncurable or incurable optimist, but the system, the multilateral trading system we had was not only not fault-free, it had severe weaknesses, and I'm just asking whether this is a crisis we had to have, which may kind of bring to the attention of some of the free riders of the multilateral trading system that they have to contribute more. And we, of course, remember that one of your India might be a case in point, and one of your previous trade ministers had was enjoying to be difficult in Geneva and elsewhere. So this may be useful. It may be a phase where we kind of redefine how we want to organize the system rather than completely writing it off. So that's the optimistic part of it. I don't want to comment on factor price equalization and migration. This is perhaps a bit going a bit too far. But what I would like to point out, and this is a fundamental issue, and there is very little debate on that, in an era of unrestricted capital flows, it becomes very difficult to tax corporate profits. This is something, and this in turn makes it more complicated to compensate those negatively affected by trade liberalization. I don't want to use the term losers, but you know what I mean. This is nothing new. I mean, Richard Cooper wrote about that in the 1990s. When we have unrestricted capital flows, Apple and the others can hide profits wherever it suits them. And unless we address that, it will be difficult to generate the political support for trade, for further trade liberalization. And in that context, what we have is a backlash which basically reflects the unwillingness of policymakers and owners of capital to establish a system where the beneficiaries of globalization contribute to, well, a certain social stability within societies. And dare I say that as a German, of course, we have that problem in particular. You would think that in Germany, corporate profits have been high, true, but have German corporations paid high taxes? No. Taxation in Germany is much lower than in the OECD average. And so in my own country, I have a case in point and something to criticize. And I think there is room for improvement, not just in my country on that issue.
Okay, I beg your indulgence to be as brief as possible, since it will reduce our lightning round to a spark round if you go on too long. So a quick intervention, and then we'll go to the response by the panelist.
Yeah. Good morning. Małgorzata Bonikowska. I come from Poland, European Union. I am not an economist. I am a political scientist. I have just one question, especially to Mr. Chadha. In your research, you were talking, thank you very much, it was very interesting to hear, but I understood this was more the classical approach to the economic growth. In Europe, we discuss now the consequences of the fourth or even fifth industrial revolution, implementation of all these new technologies, artificial intelligence, and especially e-commerce. I just want to ask you how far and what would be, in your perspective, the influence of these new phenomena to the international trade and economic growth as well. Thank you.
Okay, so panelists have, and especially Dr. or Rajesh has several questions. So to him, and so you have to select those because we only have a few minutes left, and the other panelists. So I'll start with you, and you can, if you can combine response to multiple questions, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Jim. I think many questions and difficult subject. I will be very selective, but it will be covering most of the discussion that we have had. First of all, Jim, your question on democracy and liberalism and sustainability of economic growth, Asia, if we want to be specific too, I think I would worry if we have to learn the hard way that we reached in 1948 to sign such agreements after being punished by a war. The situation that I am seeing as of now is frightening. So the saner people in the room and across the globe would definitely must think of not letting 1948 happen, but cure before we lost we have lost the world, or a new, I don't want to say the word because it is frightening, a new war. So it's absolute must that democracy and liberalism and liberal trade, anyway, trade is the, after all, if the post-World War scenario, what was the binding force? The binding for whatever holes there were was the trade discipline, and trade discipline mattered till US threw it out of the gear and others copycatted. That's one observation. My second observation is about the movement of natural, TMNP, temporary movement of natural persons. This is just one of the 4 modes, by the way. There are 3 other modes that are operating on trade in services. And I would be very mindful and remind you that mode 3 is also equally important and can be easily handled, where developing countries must keep their best foot forward, that is commercial presence. Commercial presence by its own nature brings in the country domestic managers, the country persons. So not touching upon the most sensitive issue first, let us first talk about mode 3, that is commercial presence. That'll be my second last point is that, yes, there is time for India and RCEP to be done right. I don't think India is out of it. For whatever reasons, it might have been said earlier that India cannot afford to be, once WTO is not there, trade discipline is not there, and I am a full votary of India-EU agreement. In fact, I had written a paper about 15 years ago, even on India-US bilateral trade agreement. There were some issues that you can read. It is a published paper. But more importantly, at the moment, I think India-EU and India-RCEP is writing on the wall. Earlier, the better than later. The only thing I have done, by the way, is nobody has discussed, I have not seen a paper which talks about bringing South Asia on the board. So in my model, if you see, I have the first simulation where the South Asian 4 countries make a block, which is difficult, as we all know. And finally, yes, I agree with the point of classical approach that I have used, and the criticism is that I have used only trade tariffs in my exercise, but I am very much mindful of the other aspects that are important, which are just not border-based, but deeper internal reforms and deeper internal integration. Lastly, why this is the last point, why I worry about what you're saying, artificial intelligence. I worry about robots coming, but it does not frighten me to the same extent as the literature and some people think about. Note that share of manufacturing in India's GDP is just 17 to 18%. Everything has changed in India over the last 20 years. What has not changed is the share of manufacturing remains at pity 17 to 18%, which means, and on top of that, only 9% are employed in the organized sector. So there is a huge unorganized sector still sitting, and robots cannot come and dictate in 5 years' time. I think there is a lot to be done on putting the manufacturing back on rails, and I am very mindful of that, ma'am. Thank you. I stop here.
Manoj.
I do think that a liberal economic order is necessary, not only for India, but for the enhancing the world economic growth and maintaining it. It will go through calibrations. After all, each country will try to see their own cost benefit. It will go through calibrations, we have to adjust it. But I think overall it will pay all the countries to go together in some way or other. So that way the democratic institutions do provide the proper forum for that. I also think that one of the reasons why the WTO failed is because of its dispute settlement mechanism. I think the way the decision-making process was in the WTO, it was too democratic, and that didn't work in a system where small players can dictate many things. We have to keep that in mind in future. I will not go more into that. On the US-China tariff effect, so when other countries are in the trade war, there is scope for some countries to take advantage of it, but they might be able to take advantage, they may not be able to take advantage also. And I'll say that India is a small player in the entire world trade and world GDP also. Our GDP is only around 3% of world GDP. So given that, China's is about 10%. Given these differences, or possibly China's is a little bit more than 10, there is scope for small players to take advantage of it. And there is the world trade is too large. There are always areas where you can take advantage. And it might be possible, whether it is US-China tariff war or not, independent of that, India's trade, it is possible for us to enhance the trade. If we are not doing it, if we are reversing some of the things, it is our own making in recent years. But I'll just make one more point, that in the new world economic order, the way things are going, in the earlier days, there was broad consensus on growth because it created employment. The benefits of growth was widespread. That is not so in the current world scenario. And it is here that we need to think of some new instruments, how to maximize the benefit of growth to a large section of the people. After the World War, the developed countries had several social security measures. They adopted that, and that created kind of stability in the system. We are not certain whether we can do exactly the same way, but whatever way we can do, for example, we can certainly go for some kind of unemployment insurance. If we can do that, that will possibly create stability in the system. And then we can, as income is enhanced after 10, 15 years, we can rethink of other measures. Thank you.
Johnny, if you can make some few concluding comments.
I just would like to respond to your comments. Yes, you are right that macroeconomic policies are one of the concerns. And as I was in my discussion, what I was trying to point out is that long-run growth policies are the important things that has become the focus of the policymakers in both sets of countries. And since Robert Solow's neoclassical growth model that emerged in 1957, the developed world has been, following that, the assumption that it's according to that everything will be okay in terms of markets, playing, and market will take care of everything and growth will happen. But that is, since the global financial crisis, that belief has become, is getting questioned, and the developed world is coming with some sort of a thinking of new structuralist view, which where they are advocating, like Stiglitz and Justin Lin. They advocated policies like the government's role in how government can act as a catalyst for increasing investment, for providing access to finance and education, and all these are, and they think that this is that could be the important channel for, leading to higher growth, and that the kind of the stabilizing the macroeconomic situation in there. And and in the developing sets of economies, we already say that government has a lot of things to do in terms of infrastructure buildings, physical, education, health, and everything. So it's as a macroeconomist, I don't believe that only trade policies cannot solve this problem. It has to be macro policies and trade policies.
Thank you very much. Despite best efforts, we are still, because of we're behind last session behind. The coffee break will be just 10 minutes in duration, because we have the minister coming, and we have the session on She Leads, and I want to make sure that we have the full time for that. So if we will now break. I want to thank the panel for another engaging session, and more food for thought during the break, which you have 10 minutes to consume.